Next on the list, Akira Maeda versus Riki Choshu.
The shoot kick.
Yeah, that was actually in a six-man match, I believe, and it was a shoot kick, yeah.
Well, then did they have, but they didn't have, he's not saying they had a single match shoot here. That the list is the shoot kick they're talking about or referring to.
Yes, that is what this is talking about. Yeah.
And which that was Akira Maeda, who started the first version of the UWF in Japan as a shoot-style promotion because he was disgruntled. He was both disgruntled and possessed of quite a large ego. He didn't like the Americans. He didn't like the way he was treated in America. He didn't like American-style wrestling. He thought it should be all Japanese and more of a shoot, and he was a pain in the ass to... He was with, at one point, both All Japan and New Japan, wasn't he? But he was more of a New Japan guy. No, he was just a New Japan guy.
He was a New Japan guy. He became disenchanted with a lot of things. He went on tour with the WWF, and he was working like opening matches with Rene Goulet, and it just didn't work well. But at the same time in Japan, there was the embezzlement scandal, which saw Shinma get ousted from New Japan, and also Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, quit New Japan. And he put out a book called Kayfabe. You may remember basically saying wrestling's fake. So the original UWF was Shinma, Tiger Mask, now the Super Tiger, and then Maeda, Fujiwara, Takada, and that whole crew of guys.
That's right, the whole shooter group.
And it was big in Tokyo, but it did no business anywhere outside of Tokyo. So by, I think...
Didn't they do $1 million gate one time in Tokyo itself?
Well, the second version of the UWF after the shoot kick.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's the thing. After the shoot
kick... All right,
kick,
I should be letting you talk, because you're better at Japanese history than I am.
But what I was going to say is, so eventually those guys go back, and there's some great stuff with... There's a elimination match with Team New Japan led by Inoki versus Team UWF led by Maeda. One of my favorite matches of that era. But Maeda and that crew go back to New Japan... And while all this is going on, Riki Choshu and his crew had jumped to All Japan. And then they jumped back. And there was a lot of resentment towards Riki Choshu. And then all of a sudden in this match, I haven't watched it in a while. I think he had someone in the Scorpion Deathlock.
He did. He had one of the opponents locked in the Scorpion and both of his arms obviously tied up in that. And here comes Maeda, right? And fucking throws the kick. Full blast to the face, broke his orbital bone. Did some other damage or whatever, and they're like, fuck it, and they fired him again.
And by the way, coming out of that, Maeda became bigger than ever. They started a second version of the UWF, and
that's the one that popped.
They did major business over 88 and 89 with him and Takada. They brought Bob Backlund in, and Maeda was the biggest star in Japanese wrestling during that period of time, and also...
Well, now, and wait a minute. Somebody out there just said they brought Bob Backlund in. Where'd that come from? Backlund was a fucking NCAA champion and hotshot amateur, and it fit what they were trying to do. They didn't bring him in because he was the phony WWF champion.
While it was a work, they did everything they could to portray that version of the UWF as being a shoot. And because of that, and seeing that All Japan and New Japan had tons of screwjob finishes in that era, all of a sudden, those companies started doing clean finishes again because of the popularity and the rise of the UWF, which then split off into various, pro wrestling Fujiwara Gumi and Rings and Pancrase. It all kind of came out of that version of the UWFI. It all kind of came out of that version of the UWF.
So Maeda was a huge deal.
Oh, yeah.
And a huge name in 80s Japanese wrestling, and very influential and was involved in those movements that you just talked about. But in this case, once again, it was a shoot kick. In terms of, in strict definition, it was a real kick, but there was no shooting physically amongst Riki Choshu and Akira Maeda. Choshu was tied up and not knowing it was coming, and he fucking fed his face, and Maeda came in and kicked it in. And boom. And that falls into the category of unprofessional behavior.
Next on the list, Andre the Giant versus Akira Maeda.
Well, that one was unplanned, and it was also fucking boring, but it was fascinating. What's it say there? What is their description of it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't call that match boring. That one's really uncomfortable to watch.
Well, it's I wouldn't say boring. It's not like, see, people think, oh, a shoot, and they're just going to dive in and start swinging and fighting and scratching and gouging. It was uncomfortable and weird, but it wasn't. It was exciting in a slow motion way. I'll say that.
The description here says, big can be more inviting than intimidating depending on who you are standing across the ring from. There are mixed opinions of this match over the years, with some claiming that this was a worked shoot. One version is that neither man wanted to lose the match. Another version was that Antonio Inoki booked Andre to teach Maeda a lesson. This is more plausible. Maeda returned to New Japan Pro Wrestling from the UWF with a ton of heat for mocking the fake New Japan style, fake in quotes. Regardless, Andre showed Maeda early that he wasn't playing ball and no-sold Maeda. In turn, Maeda began kicking him in the legs. Maeda wasn't as gutsy to get on the ground with Andre. Antonio Inoki wound up coming out and stopping the match after it came to a standstill long enough. I have to say, we'll talk to Bertrand Hebert about this match. A very uncomfortable match, I find, to watch. And there have been rumors that Andre was drunk or Andre wasn't drunk, but it is late stage Andre. This isn't Andre in 1982 or Andre in 1976.
Right.
This is late stage Andre and a guy just teeing off on his legs.
It was 86.
86,
I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
86. And okay, once again, since you're the memory expert on your Japanese history, what was did we ever find out the real instigation of why that Andre decided he wasn't going to fucking suffer this fucking guy that day?
I don't know if there's a concrete story. There's still a lot of people who have different opinions. Like I said, we'll talk to Bertrand about it because I know he researched it. But I think Andre may have been loaded in the ring and not working with Maeda. And Maeda, he wasn't going to be embarrassed. He wasn't going to have someone...
Well, but here's the thing. Andre was loaded in the ring on more than one occasion. And we say loaded. People had seen Andre drink gallons of alcohol and not be fallen down drunk. Andre had been drinking probably quite heavily, but was still capable of doing what Andre at that point could do if he wanted to do it. And for some reason, he was pissed off. He didn't like Maeda. Maeda had said something, done something. Somebody told him something, whatever. And he's just not going to fucking cooperate with this guy. And you can see Maeda doesn't know exactly what's going on. And then he gets pissed because now this is the in between the time that he had left and formed the first shoot group, and he comes back before he had left again, but he was still trying to keep himself strong because he had already made some noise, and in the people's eyes, he's supposed to be the real deal. And, he's got, and Andre, as you mentioned, was not his 1974 physical self. So it just broke down. And then, as you said, Maeda starts fucking full kicking Andre's legs, and it was uncomfortable, and you could hear it. But at the same time, he wasn't going to get anywhere near the fucking giant to be able to grab him. So it was a souped up fucking Ali Inoki, only the Ali part was being played by a 7-foot fucking 500-pound giant. Sound like Hulk Hogan now. And Maeda was doing the Inoki strategy. And I think even if Maeda could have gotten him down on the mat, unless he had just kicked him and knocked him out, he couldn't have done anything with him, because you couldn't. I don't even know if somebody like Maeda could have submitted a guy like Andre with that much, not only limbs that size, but that much pull strength especially. I mean, I know he was broke down at that point, but they always said that Andre wouldn't have even been a world-class bench presser. He didn't have pushing strength, but he had incredible pull strength. And but that was an unplanned shoot that was stopped before we found out what would fucking happen. And probably everybody in the building was glad that it was over.